Sequelitis, a condition in which a sequel to a game is made and it's uninspired, dull, drab, etc. Now, this isn't the case with every sequel that doesn't dramatically shift its formula, but it provides a good contrast for what we're going to talk about today. The ones that do dramatically shift their formula. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 sequels that drastically changed the whole franchise. At number 10, we're going to start off with Final Fantasy XVI. Now, this is a game that has drastically changed more than once. In fact, within the genre, it kind of drastically changes every single title, even before they started shifting genres. The difference between Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy VI, in my opinion, is quite drastic. Although somebody might argue with me on account they all have turn-based battle systems, I think beyond the surface similarities, those turn-based battle systems are very different. There's jobs, there's classes. Once we hit Final Fantasy VII, there's materia. In Final Fantasy VIII, there's a card game that maybe I don't love. But this kind of change, though actually fairly drastic, at least by my own opinion, is not the kind of change we're talking about. Final Fantasy XI is an MMO. Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO. Final Fantasy XV is a road trip buddy comedy / noodle commercial. But none of them drastically changed the game franchise in the way that Final Fantasy XVI has. Now, I was actually really skeptical of Final Fantasy XVI. For one, they're obviously going for kind of a Game of Thrones thing, and I think everybody's been burned by that enough at this point. Between the actual Game of Thrones show just outwardly sucking ass by the end, and the many things that have attempted to go for a Game of Thrones thing, I was hesitant. And then I played the demo, and I was pretty sold because the type of gameplay that we got hooked me. So you got all of this Final Fantasy crap going on, the same kind of big, grand, wild story, except instead of turn-based battles, it's Platinum Games. And I didn't know it was Platinum Games up until I played the demo, and I was like, what's going on here? That's when I found out that they were involved, and I was like, okay, all right, well, that makes perfect sense. And I know Final Fantasy XVI hasn't necessarily lit the world on fire. It sold pretty well, but it's also a Final Fantasy game, and it's gonna sell pretty well. But a lot of people pointed at it as a failure, and it was not that. It sold millions of copies. Square Enix often has kind of stupid standards, and apparently they didn't think that it sold enough, but they also blamed the slow adoption of the PlayStation 5, which makes sense. They're porting the game to the PC, so that does indicate a belief in the product. But honestly, Final Fantasy XVI works for me. I'm not going to say that every single change on this list is going to be a positive one, but I liked this one. At number 9 is Fallout 3. Now, your old pal Falcon the Game Bird is a 90s gamer at the core, and Fallout 1 and 2 were games I absolutely loved. I was always bigger into JRPGs than Western RPGs, or CRPGs as we were calling them at the time, computer RPGs, as though computer meant something different than Japan. But Fallout, along with a few others, were big exceptions for me. Both Fallout 1 and 2 were these incredible top-down games that gave you so many different possibilities narratively, in combat, just in everything. They are really landmark games, and Fallout 3 is so dissimilar to them in so many ways. And a lot of people who loved the original games hate Fallout 3. If you go back to stuff that was said when Fallout 3 came out, people were saying Fallout 3 fails, not just as a Fallout game, but as a game. It's just Oblivion with guns. The writing is terrible. I don't know why I'm using this voice. I guess in my mind, Ron Burgundy is criticizing Fallout 3. I don't know. For everything about Fallout 1 and 2 that's great, they're not perfect. A lot of people complained that Fallout 3 was badly written compared to Fallout 2, but Fallout 2 is kind of, let's say not completely consistent. In terms of mechanics, it's definitely a better game than the first, but the first game kind of works better in its more minimalist storytelling. I think Bethesda actually was a step up in terms of writing, and I think that Fallout 3 is a step up in terms of game. I really enjoy Fallout 3. My favorite Fallout game is New Vegas, actually, and Fallout 3 walked so New Vegas could run, even though the people in charge of Fallout 3 did everything they possibly could to kneecap the running of New Vegas. Despite that, it's incredible. And yeah, there's some marked differences beyond simply the fact that these are 3D games versus 2D games now. For instance, the Bethesda games do not reference the fact that these are games, at least not in any significant capacity. And come on, Ron Perlman. Ron Perlman!
War. War never changes. The Romans waged war to gather slaves and wealth.
And number 8 is Yakuza Like a Dragon. Now, Yakuza is, as you know, a brawler. It's a fantastic series of brawlers that I enjoy the hell out of. I love Judgment and Lost Judgment, and in a lot of ways, these games are kind of like the 3D Streets of Rage. One of the producers of Yakuza was involved in Shenmue. It was originally built on Virtua Fighter technology, and that stuff mixes together to make something genuinely great. And then, in Like a Dragon, they decided it was going to be a turn-based JRPG now, which is a weird choice. Like, Yakuza Like a Dragon is Yakuza 7. It is a mainline entry into Yakuza, and Yakuza is this now. And I'm not gonna lie, I really love Yakuza Like a Dragon. I think it's a great game, but I'm still reeling. I'm a huge Yakuza fan, and now it's called Like a Dragon. They changed the series title in the US so that it's all like a dragon, so that, again, it's consistent with Japan now, because that's what it's called there. And the next one, called Infinite Wealth, is continuing the story, continuing the JRPG stuff, and also adding in sections where the brawler gameplay comes back. If there's one thing you can't call this series at this point, it's stale. It is not. And I respect it for that, even though sometimes I feel like I don't know what's really going on. And number 7 is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is such a ubiquitous game at this point. Sometimes I think people don't necessarily think about just how big of a change it is from any previous Zelda game. In fact, the 3D Zeldas that came out probably bear more in common with the older 2D Zeldas than they do with Breath of the Wild in terms of overall structure. Zelda has always been a game with a hub world, dungeons, a certain order that would be optimal to complete them in, and although it felt open and free compared to a lot of the games that came out beside it, Mario for instance, it was still a pretty linear experience that followed pretty traditional gameplay structures. Even Twilight Princess, which I mean you can look at and think is weird, when you boil it down to structure, is not that weird. The only major departure, in fact, in my opinion, is Majora's Mask, which really experiments with the structure, still giving you a fairly linear story in the form of a time loop. It might seem non-linear given the fact it's a time loop, but there's only so many ways to traverse through that story. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is such a big change. You pretty much get all the powers at the start of Breath of the Wild. It's up to you what to do with them. You can tackle the divine beasts, which have been taken over by Calamity Ganon, in basically any order you really want to. And a lot of the game is about exploring the world, which doesn't require any specific approach. There are certain things you'll need to acquire or do in order to get to certain areas, like you will need to be fireproof for hanging out in the Goron's town, but you don't really need to complete any divine beast to become fireproof. You have to explore and find the stuff that you need for that. Breath of the Wild introduced this new triangle-based philosophy in open world development, which always directs your eye towards something to explore. And wow, does it work. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom by extension are still probably the best example of an open world design. There's just something about it that feels like anything you do is worthwhile, and that's abnormal. with open world design. So much of what happens in Breath of the Wild, and again by extension Tears of the Kingdom, is player directed. That is to say, the developers created tools for the player to do things, and the player decides exactly how to execute that. That sounds kind of basic, but to the extent that it happens in Breath of the Wild is an extent we have not seen in other games. Yes, a lot of games have certainly taken cues from Breath of the Wild since, but before, absolutely not. At number 6 is Resident Evil 4. Now, I have a bit of a complicated relationship with Resident Evil 4. I did not like this game when it came out. Why? Because of the aiming system. I know this is controversial, but on the GameCube, it sucks. I consider the Wii version the one that makes the aiming worthwhile for the game. And then the game becomes pretty fun for me. As such, I didn't really love all of the various ports of it after the Wii because the Wii was kind of the way that the controls were tolerable for me. And I'm not one to say that about a lot of Wii games, might I add. But if you're gonna have tank controls, then the way that they set up aiming for the GameCube is just terrible. But it works on the Wii when you can actually visually do it. I don't know how best to put it. These might be controversial opinions too. And for me, the definitive version of Resident Evil 4 is probably the remake, and that'll bother some people. I've seen certain commentators talk about how it's a theme park version of Resident Evil 4 and certain elements were lost. I don't care. I love the Resident Evil 4 world and story, but wow, not having tank controls? That is such a big difference for me. And I had to set this up because even though I have this opinion on the controls of the original game, Resident Evil 4 didn't just change Resident Evil, it changed most games. Like, the third-person shooter genre owes so much to Resident Evil 4. It established so many hallmarks of how a third-person shooter was going to work correctly in 3D that although the controls are not really how we control games now, almost every other design cue from this game has some influence on every third-person shooter you play. To call it a landmark title is a massive understatement. Going from pre-rendered to 3D and having it work for people for this type of game expanded what people thought of how that kind of game could even turn out. No, it certainly wasn't the only third-person shooter of its time, but it's certainly the most influential. Resident Evil 5 and 6 obviously took a lot from 4, and I think people are less hateful of those two games nowadays, particularly 6, which used to just get people angry to mention. It seems like people are softening a little nowadays for it. Resident Evil 7, again, switched up the series with the first-person stuff, and somehow managed to make first-person feel like Resident Evil, not like something else. Like, they start off making you think that they're trying to turn Resident Evil into PT, and then it's clear that it's Resident Evil. Somehow they've managed to keep that through line even through Resident Evil Village. And now with all of the older remakes happening, the experience of every single one of these games, I think, has created the Resident Evil style. And I have a feeling that's what we're going to be seeing from now on. At number 5 is The Bureau, XCOM Declassified. Now, this was a game that actually came out after the XCOM reboot and is meant to be in the same continuity, but it is very dissimilar. First off, XCOM and its reboot series are turn-based tactics games. The Bureau, on the other hand, is a third-person shooter. And this one is maybe a little bit less of a positive one. Where I have criticism for Resident Evil 4's original release, it is undoubtedly something that is incredibly positive in terms of the development of both Resident Evil and games as a whole. A lot of what I remember of the Bureau is that it took all of the cool stuff from XCOM and made it somehow less exciting while happening in real time.
Get behind that! Watch my back!
Like, there's some cool things about it. Some interesting ideas that didn't really work. Like the way that you recruited people in it. It sounded cool, but in practice wasn't. A lot of stuff like that. The combat was kind of inconvenient, and the story didn't make it worthwhile. And fortunately, the XCOM reboot did incredibly well, and we got more of that. This was a massive change for the series, and thankfully it changed back. At number 4 is Spec Ops: The Line, a game that really changed the series in many ways. First off, Spec Ops was kind of just a straightforward military shooter series, and the lunatics that made Spec Ops: The Line have a real YOLO or F it style attitude, because they were like, we're gonna make a game that's a criticism of those games. So they made this incredibly mature psychological investigation, not only into war, but war video games as a whole. There's a ton of moral decisions presented in the game that are just absolutely not classifiable as black or white moral decisions. And the consequences of those choices are very obvious within the course of the game. It functionally questions the ethics of the kind of decisions you're supposed to make in a military shooter. And on top of that, it does a whole lot with character development throughout. Spec Ops: The Line is nowadays regarded as something of a cult classic, but it was a commercial failure when it came out, and it essentially ended the series, which is another big change.
Sway! I need some cover here!
He's in the open!
Pinned down!
Keep pushing!
Reloading!
What sucks so much is that Duke Nukem Forever allegedly sold better and was considered a commercial success, while Spec Ops: The Line languished. And it was probably, on the name recognition of Duke Nukem, because it wasn't because the game was good. Meanwhile, Spec Ops: The Line, considerably better game. Ultimately, Timo Ullman, the managing director of Jaeger Development, the developers behind this game, ended up saying that the market for games like Spec Ops: The Line is too small, and that kind of necessitates that as a part of a large company trying to make money, they don't make more of them, which is a shame, but also kind of predictable. The expectation for a lot of military shooters is kind of a power fantasy, and it was an outward critique of that. So, yeah, while I might agree with and like it, I don't not understand why it didn't do well. And number 3 is Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, released in 2008 for the Xbox 360. While there were 2 Game Boy Advance games in the mid-2000s, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was the first mainline game in the series in 8 years. It was also pretty self-referential. It would kind of break the fourth wall a bit. It acknowledged that there was a very big hiatus, and it actually received kind of mixed reception among fans and critics alike. You see, it introduced vehicle development into the mix. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie are very traditional platformers, collectathons, and Nuts and Bolts is very oriented towards vehicle construction. And don't get me wrong, it's cool. I think it's a good idea. In fact, I would even argue there's a decent chance that the Tears of the Kingdom developers looked back on Nuts and Bolts for a couple of ideas, what went well, what went wrong in Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. But the traditional platforming elements probably should have been kept in as well on top of that. And I guess, like, to some extent they are, but they are not a big part of the game compared to the vehicles. And the mixed response, I think, was pretty well reflected in sales for the game. They really weren't that strong. To be fair, in the years following Nuts and Bolts release, it's gotten more of a reevaluation. People can look back at it as kind of something different from the original Banjo-Kazooie games, because it is. It was separated by a lot of time and a lot of developments. For instance, Rare had been bought by Microsoft, and this was actually its last non-Kinect game, which yikes. And former Rare employees made a spiritual successor called Yooka-Laylee back in 2017, which they crowdfunded, if you remember. It's a pretty good game, but it also kind of just felt like, it's another one of those. In some ways, the things that they tried to do with Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts were important, because with Yooka-Laylee, yeah, it's a pretty faithful collectathon platformer that feels a lot like Banjo-Kazooie. But, I mean, we've seen it a lot at this point. Mario is still, by all intents and purposes, collectathon games, but they've added so much to it. It makes sense that when Rare revisited Banjo-Kazooie, they took a different approach. And unfortunately, it was the last one. I hope someday there's another one. And I also hope that they don't just throw together a Nintendo 64 level one. I do hope that some things are learned from Nuts and Bolts, despite it maybe not being great itself. And number 2 is Guilty Gear 2 Overture, which takes Guilty Gear, a fighting game, and decides, hey, what if we were influenced a little bit by Devil May Cry or Dynasty Warriors, as well as real-time strategy games a bit. So yeah, basically, you ran around like Dynasty Warriors or Devil May Cry, being an unstoppable badass, but also summoning and managing various units on the battlefield. You had to capture key points, manage resources, and strategically summon and direct these various units. Weirdly enough, it actually just continues the story of the previous Guilty Gear games. That's, I think, probably the strangest aspect about it. It's a completely different game. It's also pretty good. Back at the time, it wasn't received super well because it was kind of experimental and considered to be genre mixing in a bad way. I would ultimately say this is what experimentation is often regarded as by people who are established fans of series and have specific expectations, which is kind of a double-edged sword. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing either. And sales kind of matched what you might expect, given that. The developers recognized that it was maybe a direction they didn't want to continue in because it didn't do very well, and they moved back to the fighting roots of Guilty Gear moving forward. And finally, at number 1, it's Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures. I don't think I even have to describe to you how different what you're looking at is from Pac-Man. But just understanding it's different isn't necessarily understanding it. Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures is basically Mario if you couldn't control Mario. Pac-Man's just got a mind of his own, and what you can do is guide or influence him. Yes, what you do is call attention to the various things going on screen, whether it be an obstacle or an item. And that's, I guess, innovative. Looking back, there are actually people who considered this to be an interesting control scheme. I rented this game as a kid because way back in the day, people who didn't have tons of money in order to play everything had to rent them. And that's how I experienced titles like this, where it's like, I don't really know what this is, but it looks cool. And it did, and it's Pac-Man, it's familiar. Cool, they made Pac-Man 2. I'll rent this. And then as it turns out, you rented a dud, so this weekend sucks. I mean, there's aspects of it that have a lot of charm, but charm a game does not make, at least alone. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.